Rain hammered against the slate roof of Cashen's Gap that September night in 1931, a relentless percussion that should have masked any other sound. But there, beneath the drumming water, the Irving family heard something else. A voice. High-pitched, chattering, impossible. It came from inside the walls themselves. James Irving, a traveling salesman, sat rigid in his chair. His wife Margaret gripped the armrest of the sofa. Their 13-year-old daughter Voirrey stared at the wooden paneling, watching it as if she could see through to whatever thing was speaking to them. The voice wasn't muffled or distant. It was clear, conversational, and it knew things, private things, secrets that no stranger could possibly know. The creature called itself Gia. It sang music hall songs in perfect pitch. It quoted the Bible. It hurled profanities that made Margaret blush. And when James demanded to know what manner of thing it was, the voice replied with chilling precision. An extra clever mongoose. For the next 6 years, this family of 3, isolated on a remote farmstead on the Isle of Man, would become witnesses to something that defied every natural law ordeal. Multiple visitors, including a photographer from London, a paranormal investigator, and journalists from the mainland press, would come to Cashen's Gap and hear it too. 6 credible witnesses, unconnected to the family, documented conversations with something that should not exist. Here is the central question that has haunted researchers for nearly a century. What happens when rational people, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, all confirm the same impossible thing? When a phenomenon is witnessed, not just by believers or the superstitious, but by skeptics who arrived, determined to expose a hoax. The GF case remains unexplained, a wound in the fabric of consensus reality that refuses to heal. The wind came first. Always the wind, rolling off the Irish Sea and across the moorlands of the Isle of Man, carrying with it the salt spray and the gathering mist that would settle into the hollows and crevices of that ancient landscape. By the time it reached Cashen's Gap, some 4 miles south of the small town of Dalby on the western slopes of South Barrule Mountain, the wind had gathered up all the loneliness of that desolate place and pressed it against the stone walls of a simple farmhouse that sat like a cairn among the heather and gorse. This was the home of the Irving family in the early months of 1931, though to call it a home suggests something more welcoming than what stood there on that windswept hillside. The cottage was a structure born of practicality and poverty, built from the gray limestone that jutted from the earth itself. Its walls were thick, 2 feet of uneven stone mortared together with whatever materials the builders could scrape together, creating a patchwork of rock and filler that left gaps and hollows throughout the structure. These were not the clean, measured walls of a proper house. They were agricultural walls, farm walls, built to keep out the worst of the weather, while accepting that some of it would inevitably find its way inside. The roof was thatched, though by 1931 the thatching had grown thin in places, stained dark by years of rain and the smoke that leaked from the chimney on those rare occasions when the wind allowed it to escape upward rather than forcing it back down into the rooms below. The whole structure sat low against the land, as if trying to avoid notice, trying to present as small a target as possible to the elements that assaulted it day after day, month after month, year after year. James Irving had purchased this property in 1916, 15 years before the events that would make Cashen's Gap known far beyond the shores of the Isle of Man. He was a man of 60 years by 1931, his face weathered by decades of farming in one of the most inhospitable corners of the British Isles. He had been a farmer all his life, knowing nothing but the hard work of coaxing sustenance from reluctant soil, of tending to animals in all weather, of making do with whatever materials and resources the land and his meager income could provide. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. Practical necessity had been his constant companion for too long to allow room for superstition or imagination. His wife Margaret was cut from similar cloth. She had married James knowing full well what kind of life awaited her in that isolated cottage, and she had accepted it with the same stoicism that characterized the women of her generation who found themselves tied to the land and to men who worked it. She kept the house as best she could, cooked what meals the farm provided, and raised their daughter Voirrey in the only way she knew how, preparing her for a life that would likely mirror her own. Voirrey Irving was 13 years old when the disturbances began. She had been born into isolation, knowing little of the world beyond the moorlands and the occasional trip into Dalby or Peel. Her education came from the local school when weather and farm duties permitted her attendance, but more often she was kept at home to help with the endless work that farm life demanded. She was a quiet girl. Observers would later note, somewhat withdrawn, living largely in her own thoughts in that cottage, where the nearest neighbor was more than a mile away across the boggy moorland. The cottage itself consisted of just a few rooms, arranged in the simple layout common to agricultural dwellings of that era in economic class. The main living area served as kitchen, dining room, and general gathering space, dominated by the hearth that provided what warmth and cooking fire the family enjoyed. A small scullery attached to the back served for washing and food preparation. Upstairs, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step, were 2 bedrooms where the family slept under the thatched roof, listening to the rain drum against it on wet nights and feeling the wind find its way through every crack and gap. But it was those gaps, those spaces within the walls and between the stones, that would become central to the terror or mystery, or whatever it was that descended upon Cashen's Gap in the autumn of 1931. The construction of the cottage had left numerous hollows and voids within its walls. Some of these were intentional, the result of a building technique that used 2 parallel walls with rubble fill between them. Others were simply the consequence of inexpert construction. Stones that did not quite meet, mortar that had crumbled away over the years, spaces where small creatures might nest or hide or move about unseen. Rats were common in such structures. Mice even more so. The Irvings, like any farming family of that era, would have been well accustomed to the sounds of small animals moving within their walls, the scratching and scurrying that formed a constant backdrop to their lives. They would have thought nothing of such noises, accepted them as simply another aspect of living in an old stone cottage in the countryside. The isolation of Cashen's Gap cannot be overstated. This was not a cottage at the edge of a village where neighbors might be called upon in times of trouble. This was genuine remoteness of the kind that has largely disappeared from the British Isles in the modern era. The nearest occupied dwelling was over a mile away across terrain that became treacherous in wet weather, which was most of the time. The road that led to the property, if it could be called a road, was little more than a rutted track that turned to mud with every rainfall and was frequently impassable during the winter month. The moorland that surrounded the cottage stretched in all directions, rolling hills of purple heather and brown sedge-grass, dotted with outcroppings of gray rock, and cut through with small streams that swelled with every storm. On clear days, one could see across to the mountains that formed the spine of the island, but clear days were rare. More often the mist rolled in from the sea, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards, and wrapping the cottage in a wet gray blanket that muffled sound and distorted perception. This was the height of the Great Depression, and while the economic collapse had begun in distant financial centers like New York and London, its effects had spread even to isolated farming communities on small islands in the Irish Sea. Money was scarce, work was scarce, hope itself seemed to be in short supply. The Irvings eked out their existence on what the farm could provide, supplemented by whatever small income James could generate from selling produce or doing occasional work for other farmers in the area. It was a hard life made harder by the economic conditions of the time, and there was little room for anything beyond the immediate struggle to survive. The psychological weight of such isolation, especially during the long, dark winters, is difficult for modern minds to fully appreciate. There was no electricity at Cashen's Gap, no telephone, no radio. When darkness fell, which it did early in those northern latitudes during winter months, the family was alone with only candlelight and the glow from the hearth to push back the darkness. The sounds of the night became amplified in such conditions. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the walls, every unexplained noise took on greater significance when there was nothing to distract from it. No artificial light to banish the shadows, no connection to the wider world to provide reassurance that they were not entirely alone. The cottage was a place where reality itself seemed to thin, where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural might become permeable. Whether you believe in such things or not, there is something about isolation and darkness, and the constant press of the elements that opens the mind to possibilities that would seem absurd in the bright light of day in a crowded city. The mist that gathered in the hollows around Cashen's Gap was not just water vapor. It was a physical manifestation of the unknown, a white void that could contain anything or nothing, that played tricks on the eyes and made familiar landmarks disappear. And into this setting, into this perfect storm of isolation and economic hardship, and the kind of darkness that is not just absence of light, but presence of something else, something would soon arrive that would transform the Irving family's anonymous struggle into one of the most bizarre and enduring mysteries of the 20th century. The stage was set. The players were in place. The gaps in the walls waited, dark and hollow, ready to serve as hiding places or pathways or doorways into something that none of them could yet imagine. In that autumn of 1934, Cashen's Gap was simply another struggling farm on the edge of nowhere. But it would not remain anonymous for long. The scratching began in September of 1931. At first it was nothing more than a faint rustling behind the wooden panels of doorless Cashen, the kind of sound that might be dismissed as mice scurrying through the walls of an old farmhouse. James Irving barely noticed it. His wife Margaret, ever practical, suggested they set traps. Their 13-year-old daughter Voirrey, perhaps more sensitive to the strangeness of their isolated world, listened with growing unease as the sounds persisted night after night. But within weeks, the scratching changed. It grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever made the noise was growing bolder, or perhaps larger. The sounds moved through the walls with deliberate purpose, following the family from room to room. When James would enter the kitchen, the scratching would travel along the wall beside him. When Margaret climbed the stairs to bed, something seemed to pace alongside her within the very structure of their home. By October, the noises had transformed into something that could no longer be explained away as rodents. The family heard spitting sounds, hissing, and what could only be described as growling. These were the sounds of something alive and aware, something that seemed to be watching them, learning their routines, their voices, their habits. The psychological impact of this realization settled over the Irving household like a heavy fog. Their home, once a refuge from the harsh landscape of the Isle of Man, had become invaded by an invisible presence that refused to reveal itself. James Irving, a traveling salesman who spent his days navigating the practical world of commerce, found himself confronting something that defied all logic. He began to observe the sounds with a kind of scientific curiosity mixed with dread. The creature, whatever it was, seemed most active at night. It would scratch and growl from within the walls, sometimes so loudly that the family could not sleep. Margaret, a woman accustomed to the hardships of rural life, found her nerves fraying. But it was Voirrey who would inadvertently change everything. In what might have been a moment of playful defiance or perhaps a desperate attempt to normalize the terror surrounding them, the young girl began to speak to the thing in the walls. She would recite nursery rhymes, simple children's verses that she had learned in school. "Mary had a little lamb," she would say into the darkness, her voice trembling slightly. Its fleece was white as snow. What happened next would haunt the Irving family for the rest of their lives. The creature began to repeat her words. At first it was barely recognizable as speech, more like the parroting of a bird, mechanical and without comprehension. The sounds were garbled, distorted, as if produced by a throat not designed for human language. But the creature was trying. It was learning. "Mary," it would rasp from behind the wooden slats. "Lamb. Snow-dado." The words came out in fragments, disconnected and strange, but unmistakably words nonetheless. Voirrey, both frightened and fascinated, continued her lessons. She taught the creature more rhymes, more words, speaking to the walls as if addressing a hidden student. And the thing learned with a speed that defied explanation. Within days, it could repeat entire phrases. Within weeks, it was constructing sentences of its own. The family's horror deepened as they realized this was not simple mimicry. A parrot could repeat sounds without understanding, but this creature seemed to comprehend meaning. It began to respond to questions, to make requests, to express opinions. The voice, high-pitched and peculiar, with an accent that seemed to shift between Welsh and Irish inflections, would echo through the farmhouse at all hours. It knew when the family was eating and would demand food. It knew when they were sleeping and would wake them with conversation. It knew their names, their habits, their secrets. The invasion of privacy was absolute and maddening. The family could no longer speak freely in their own home, could no longer assume they were alone even in the most intimate moments. The creature was always listening, always there, an invisible presence that had somehow penetrated every aspect of their lives. James Irving, a man who valued control and order, found himself negotiating with something he could not see, could not touch, could not explain. Then came the moment that would define the entire phenomenon. The creature identified itself. "I am Geff," it announced one evening, its strange voice carrying through the walls with perfect clarity. "I am a mongoose." The absurdity of the statement did nothing to diminish its impact. The family sat in stunned silence as the creature elaborated. It claimed to have been born in New Delhi, India, in 1852. It described itself as an extra clever mongoose, emphasizing its intelligence with a pride that seemed almost human. The specific phrasing, the deliberate repetition of the word extra, suggested a personality, an ego, a sense of self that no animal should possess. Geff, as the family now reluctantly called it, began to demonstrate the full extent of its learning capabilities. Its vocabulary expanded exponentially. It moved beyond simple requests and responses to engage in actual conversation. It would comment on the weather, discuss the news James brought home from town, offer opinions on the family's meals. The creature seemed to read, or at least to absorb information from somewhere, somehow. It knew things it should not have known, spoke of events happening beyond the isolated farmhouse with an accuracy that James would later verify. The psychological toll on the Irving family intensified with each passing week. They were living with something that existed in a space between animal and human, between physical and supernatural. Geff claimed to be a mongoose, a creature native to India, somehow transported to the Isle of Man and gifted with human speech. But how could they believe such a thing? Yet how could they deny what they heard every day, what had become as much a part of their household as the furniture or the hearth fire? Margaret Irving, whose initial skepticism had given way to fearful acceptance, found herself cooking extra portions for a creature she had never seen. James, the rational salesman, found himself in lengthy conversations with a voice emanating from the walls, discussing philosophy, religion, and the nature of existence itself. And Voirrey, the young girl who had first taught the creature to speak, bore, perhaps, the greatest burden. Some would later claim she was the source of the voice, a troubled child creating an elaborate hoax through ventriloquism. But those who witnessed the phenomenon firsthand insisted the voice came from multiple locations simultaneously, from places where Voirrey could not possibly be. Geff's intelligence seemed to grow with each conversation. The creature began to use complex sentence structures, to employ humor and sarcasm, to demonstrate knowledge of literature and current events. It claimed to leave the farmhouse and travel around the island, spying on neighbors and reporting back with gossip and secrets. The Irvings found themselves dependent on this invisible entity for companionship in their isolation, even as they feared and resented its constant presence. The creature's moods fluctuated wildly. It could be charming and helpful one moment, singing songs and entertaining the family with stories. Then it would turn vicious, cursing at them with language so foul that Margaret would cover her ears. It threw objects when angered, creating crashes and bangs that echoed through the house. It claimed to kill rabbits for the family, leaving their bodies as proof of its hunting prowess. The Irvings never knew which version of Geff they would encounter from one moment to the next. By the end of 1931, the Irving family's life had been completely transformed. Their home was no longer their own. An entity that called itself Geff, that claimed to be an extra clever mongoose, had invaded every corner of their existence. They lived in constant awareness of being watched, listened to, judged by something they could not see. The scratching sounds that had begun as a minor annoyance in September had escalated into a full-scale haunting by an articulate, intelligent presence that defied all rational explanation. The family was trapped, both by the isolation of their remote farmhouse and by the inexplicable phenomenon that had chosen to make their home its own. And Geff, the talking mongoose, was just beginning to reveal the full extent of its strange and terrifying capabilities. The voice itself was unsettling enough, but what truly transformed Geff from a curious oddity into something that kept the Irving family awake at night, trembling in their beds, was not the fact that he spoke. It was what he knew. In the autumn of 1934, a visitor approached Cashen's Gap, unannounced. The farm sat isolated on the slopes of Dalby Mountain, far enough from the main road that unexpected callers were rare. James Irving heard the voice before he saw anyone coming up the rocky path. But it wasn't a human voice he heard first. It was Geff, chattering excitedly from somewhere within the walls. "A man is coming," Geff announced, his high-pitched voice carrying that strange mixture of childlike enthusiasm and something darker. "He's wearing a brown coat, and he's got a limp on his left side. He's thinking about whether to turn back because the path is too rough for his bad leg." James felt his stomach tighten. He moved to the window, peering out toward the approach to their farmhouse. The path was empty. He waited, his wife Margaret joining him, both of them staring out at the barren landscape. Minutes passed. Then, emerging from behind an outcropping of rocks, a figure appeared. A man in a brown coat, favoring his left leg as he navigated the uneven ground. The visitor was a journalist from the mainland, someone neither James nor Margaret had ever met. He had not written ahead. He had not announced his intention to visit. He had simply decided that morning to make the journey to investigate the strange stories circulating about the talking mongoose. Yet Geoff had described him perfectly, down to details that should have been impossible to observe from inside a stone farmhouse with limited windows. This was not an isolated incident. It became a pattern that repeated with disturbing regularity. Geoff would announce visitors before they arrived, sometimes hours in advance. He would describe their clothing, their manner of walking, even their state of mind. When Harry Price, the famous psychic investigator, sent associates to examine the case, Geoff described them while they were still miles away. He told the Irvings which road they had taken, what color automobile they were driving, and that one of them had stopped to fix a flat tire on the way. All of this proved accurate. But Geoff's knowledge extended far beyond simple clairvoyance about approaching visitors. He claimed to roam the countryside, and he would return with detailed reports of events happening miles away from Cashen's Gap. He told the Irvings about conversations taking place in Dalby village, accurately reporting who had been arguing in the pub and what the argument had been about. When Margaret's sister fell ill in Peel, several miles away across difficult terrain, Geoff announced it before any messenger could have possibly reached the isolated farm. He described the symptoms, the doctor who had been called, even the medicine that had been prescribed. A day later, when word finally did reach the Irvings through conventional means, every detail matched what Geoff had already told them. The Irving family began to realize they were living with something that functioned as an all-seeing eye. Geoff claimed to follow neighbors, to spy on local farmers, to lurk in corners during private moments. He would report back with a voyeur's attention to detail. He told them about a neighboring farmer's secret debt, about a woman in the valley who was having an affair, about a child who had stolen money from his parents. The information was specific, intimate, and when the Irvings had opportunity to verify it through indirect means, it was invariably correct. This created a suffocating atmosphere of surveillance. If Geoff could know what was happening miles away, what did he know about them? What had he seen in their most private moments? What secrets had he witnessed that he had not yet chosen to reveal? The answer came in fragments that chilled them to their core. Geoff began to reference things that had never been spoken aloud. He mentioned a letter that Margaret had written but never sent, hidden in a drawer in her bedroom. He talked about money that James had set aside without telling his wife, tucked into a tin box under a loose floorboard. He brought up an argument between James and Margaret that had taken place years before Geoff's arrival, whispered in the dark of night when they had believed their daughter Voirrey was asleep. He quoted their exact words back to them. Most disturbingly, he knew about Voirrey's private thoughts and fears. He would mock her for things she had never shared with her parents, anxieties and dreams that she had kept locked inside her own mind. He seemed to have access not just to observable facts, but to the interior lives of everyone in the household. This impossible knowledge forced the Irvings to confront two equally terrifying possibilities. Either Geoff was genuinely some kind of supernatural entity with abilities that defied all rational explanation, or something human and malevolent had been watching them constantly, lurking in their walls, following them, documenting their lives with sinister intent. Neither option offered comfort. The atmosphere grew darker as Geoff's personality began to shift in disturbing ways. The entity that had once seemed playful, even charming in his oddness, revealed volatile mood swings that transformed him from a mischievous companion into something genuinely threatening. His language coarsened dramatically. For a conservative family living in the strict moral environment of rural Isle of Man in the early 1930s, Gieff's crude vocabulary was shocking. He would unleash strings of profanity, sexual references, and blasphemous statements that left Margaret horrified. She had raised Voirrey with careful attention to propriety and religious devotion. Now something in their walls was spewing filth, seemingly delighting in their discomfort. The voice would switch without warning from childish rhymes to gutter language that would have been more at home in a sailor's tavern than a family farmhouse. Gieff would sing obscene songs, make lewd comments about visitors, particularly women, and use language so foul that Margaret would cover her ears and pray for it to stop. But the verbal assaults were nothing compared to what came next. Gieff began to make threats. Specific, detailed threats that he sometimes carried out with disturbing precision. "I'll kill your rabbits," he would hiss in a voice completely different from his usual chattering tone. "I'll snap their necks and leave them for you to find. You are outlaw." James Irving kept rabbits in hutches near the farmhouse, both for food and for sale. They represented a meaningful portion of the family's modest income. When Gieff made his threats, James initially dismissed them as empty bluster. Whatever Gieff was, he had never physically harmed anyone. He seemed to exist as a voice, an observer, but not as something capable of physical violence. He was wrong. The family began finding rabbits dead in their hutches. Their necks were broken with what appeared to be practiced efficiency. There were no signs of forced entry into the secured hutches. No fox or weasel could have done this without leaving evidence of their intrusion. The rabbits were simply dead, killed with precision, and left for the Irvings to discover. Gieff would take credit for the killings with obvious pride. He would describe in graphic detail how he had done it, mimicking the sound of breaking bones, laughing at the family's distress. When James would secure the hutches more carefully, adding extra latches and barriers, Gieff would somehow still gain access. More rabbits would die. The message was clear and terrifying. Gieff could do more than watch and talk. He could act. He could kill. And if he could kill rabbits, what else might he be capable of? The psychological warfare escalated. Gieff would whisper threats in the darkness, promising to burn down the house, to harm visitors, to do terrible things to Voirrey. He would describe violent scenarios in disturbing detail, his voice dripping with malice. Then, just as suddenly, he would shift back to his playful persona, singing songs and asking for food as if nothing had happened. This unpredictability might have been the most unnerving aspect of all. The Irvings could never know which version of Gieff they would encounter. Would he be the curious, almost childlike entity who seemed to crave attention and affection? Or would he be the cruel, threatening presence that promised violence and demonstrated his ability to carry through on those promises? James Irving, a practical man who had spent his life working the land and dealing with concrete, solvable problems, found himself completely out of his depth. He had tried to approach Gieff rationally, to establish rules and boundaries, to understand what the entity wanted. But how do you negotiate with something that can be everywhere and nowhere, that knows your secrets, that shifts between charm and menace without warning? Margaret retreated further into prayer and religious devotion, convinced they were dealing with something demonic. She would find Voirrey sitting alone, talking to the walls, and the sight would fill her with dread. Was her daughter communicating with a spirit? Was she under some kind of influence? Or even more disturbingly, was Voirrey somehow involved in creating Gieff herself, either consciously or through some unconscious process neither of them understood? The question of Voirrey's role added another layer of paranoia to an already suffocating situation. Gieff's closest relationship seemed to be with the young girl. He would answer her calls more readily than her parents. He would moderate his language somewhat in her presence. He claimed to be her special friend, her protector. This connection raised uncomfortable questions that the Irvings struggled to articulate even to each other. Was Voirrey being manipulated by something supernatural? Was she experiencing some kind of psychological break that manifested as this elaborate delusion, somehow shared with her parents through suggestion and coincidence? Or was there something more sinister at play? Could a human being, someone watching them, be using Voirrey as an unwitting accomplice, or even a willing participant in an elaborate hoax? The surveillance aspect gnawed at James particularly. The stone walls of Cashen's Gap were thick but not impenetrable. There were gaps, spaces, hollow areas where someone sufficiently motivated could potentially hide and observe. Could a person, someone with a grudge against the family, or simply a disturbed individual drawn to their isolation, be living in their walls? Could they have been watching the family for years, gathering information, learning their habits, their secrets, their vulnerabilities? Such a person would have access to everything Geff knew. They could watch through cracks in the walls, listen to conversations, follow family members when they left the house. They could kill rabbits, throw objects, create sounds and disturbances. And they could speak, disguising their voice, creating the illusion of something supernatural to mask their very human presence. The thought was almost more terrifying than the supernatural explanation. A ghost or a spirit existed outside normal understanding, but it also existed outside normal human malice. A person hiding in their walls, watching them constantly, learning their intimate secrets, tormenting them for reasons unknown. That was a different kind of horror. That was a violation that touched on every fear about privacy, safety, and the sanctity of home. James would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of the house settling, trying to distinguish between ordinary noises and signs of human movement. Every creak became suspect. Every whisper from Geff made him wonder if somewhere in the darkness, a human being was crouched in a hidden space, watching them, smiling at their fear. The Irvings had become prisoners of impossible knowledge. Whether Geff was a supernatural entity with genuine paranormal abilities, or evidence of a human predator conducting the most intimate surveillance imaginable, the result was the same. They lived under constant observation. Nothing was private. Nothing was safe. And the presence that shared their home could shift from playful to murderous without warning or apparent reason. The morning of July 26, 1932, marked the beginning of a transformation that James Irving could never have anticipated. What had begun as his family's private torment, confined to the stone walls of their isolated farmhouse, was about to become something far more invasive. A trickle of curiosity from the outside world would soon become a flood, and Cashen's Gap would find itself thrust into the glaring spotlight of international attention. It started innocently enough. James Irving, perhaps seeking validation or simply desperate for answers, had begun corresponding with newspapers and journalists. His letters described events so bizarre, so thoroughly outside the bounds of accepted reality, that editors could scarcely believe what they were reading. A talking mongoose, a creature claiming to be 83 years old, an invisible entity that moved through walls, and knew secrets no animal should know. The story was irresistible, and the press descended upon the Isle of Man with the hunger of sharks scenting blood in the water. What followed was a parade unlike anything the quiet island had ever witnessed. Between 1932 and 1935, Cashen's Gap became a pilgrimage site for a peculiar collection of seekers. Journalists arrived with notebooks and skepticism. Paranormal researchers came with equipment and theories. Curiosity seekers simply wanted to glimpse something impossible. The Irving family found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making, their privacy shattered, their lives subjected to constant scrutiny and speculation. But three figures would emerge from this circus of investigation as particularly significant. Three men whose credentials could not be easily dismissed, whose reputations lent weight to their testimonies, and whose experiences at Cashen's Gap would haunt them for years to come. They were Harry Price, Captain MacDonald, and R.S. Lambert. Each arrived with different expectations. Each left profoundly changed by what they encountered. Harry Price was already a legend in the world of paranormal investigation by the time he turned his attention to the Isle of Man. A founding member of the National Laboratory of Psychical Research in London, Price had made his reputation by rigorously investigating claims of supernatural phenomena. He had exposed fraudulent mediums and debunked countless hoaxes. His approach was systematic, almost scientific in its methodology. If anyone could get to the truth of the Dalby spook, it would be Harry Price. Price arrived at Cashen's Gap in the summer of 1935, accompanied by R.S. Lambert, who was himself no lightweight in the credibility department. Lambert served as editor of The Listener, the BBC's prestigious publication, and he came prepared to document everything with a journalist's eye for detail. These were not gullible amateurs chasing ghost stories. These were educated, professional men whose careers depended on their ability to separate fact from fiction. From the moment they arrived, the investigators found themselves in a strange psychological game. Geoff, it seemed, would not perform on command. The Mongoose, if indeed that's what it was, controlled every aspect of the investigation. This selective manifestation would become one of the most frustrating and yet most telling aspects of the entire affair. Geoff appeared when he chose, spoke when he wished, and refused to submit to any attempt at structured examination. Price began his investigation methodically, searching the farmhouse for evidence of trickery. He examined the walls for hidden speaking tubes. He looked for concealed compartments from which a human accomplice might operate. He found nothing that could explain the phenomena. The stone walls were solid. The house, while certainly odd with its labyrinthine paneling, contained no obvious mechanisms for deception. Then came the paw prints. Price discovered them in carefully sifted flour that he had spread in certain areas as a trap. The prints were small, consistent with a small mammal, but their pattern was strange. They appeared in places that seemed impossible to reach without disturbing other elements of the trap. Price photographed them, measured them, and preserved casts. Here was physical evidence, tangible proof that something was moving through the house. But prints alone could not confirm the extraordinary claims being made. It was Lambert who had perhaps the most direct and unsettling encounter. On a cool evening, standing in the dimly lit interior of the farmhouse, Lambert heard the voice clearly. It was not a whisper. It was not a sound that could be confused with wind or the settling of old timbers. It was a distinct voice, high-pitched and peculiar, speaking with intelligence and awareness. The voice knew things it should not know. It referenced conversations Lambert had held in private. It demonstrated a wit and personality that seemed impossible to fake. Lambert would later write about this experience with a mixture of wonder and disquiet. He was careful in his language, aware of how fantastic his claims would sound to readers. Yet he could not deny what his own senses had reported. He had heard Geoff speak. He had engaged in conversation with something that had no business existing. For a man of Lambert's background, trained in rationality and editorial skepticism, this was profoundly disturbing. Captain MacDonald brought yet another perspective to the investigation. A military man accustomed to dealing with facts and concrete realities, MacDonald approached Cashen's gap with the expectation that he would quickly identify either a hoax or a natural explanation. Instead, he found himself added to the list of credible witnesses who left the farmhouse convinced that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. What particularly struck MacDonald was the consistency of the descriptions. When witnesses described Geoff's appearance, they agreed on specific details. The creature was yellow, roughly the size of a small cat or large rat. Its tail was distinctive, black-tipped and bushy. Its movements were quick, almost impossible to follow. These descriptions matched across multiple witnesses who had caught glimpses of the creature at different times. Either the Irving family had managed to orchestrate an impossibly complex hoax involving numerous independent witnesses, or something genuinely strange was living in their walls. The 6 core witnesses, those who had the most direct and sustained contact with the phenomena, remained absolutely adamant about what they had experienced. James Irving, his wife Margaret, their daughter Voirrey, and the 3 principal investigators all maintained their stories despite ridicule, despite skepticism, despite the enormous social cost of being associated with such an outlandish tale. These were not people seeking fame or fortune. Indeed, the attention brought them nothing but trouble. Yet Geoff's selective appearances created an insurmountable problem for definitive proof. The Mongoose would never appear when demanded. Attempts to trap him failed. Efforts to photograph him were frustrated. It was as though Geoff understood exactly what the investigators were trying to do and deliberately thwarted their efforts. This behavior pattern would become ammunition for the skeptics, who argued that the selective manifestation was itself proof of fraud. If Geoff were real, they reasoned, why would he not simply present himself for examination? The believers countered that this very behavior suggested something beyond simple trickery. A hoax requires consistent performance. A trained animal would respond to cues. But Geoff seemed to operate according to his own inscrutable logic. He would speak at length about trivial matters, then fall silent for days. He would appear briefly to one person while remaining invisible to others in the same room. He demonstrated what appeared to be a genuine personality, complete with moods, preferences, and a distinctly mischievous streak. Price documented instances where Gief claimed to have traveled beyond Cashen's Gap. The Mongoose spoke of visiting neighboring farms, of observing people in the nearby village of Dalby, of knowing gossip and secrets from miles away. Some of these claims were verified. Gief would tell the Irvings things about their neighbors that proved accurate information the isolated family had no normal way of knowing. This suggested either an elaborate network of informants, which seemed absurdly complex for a simple hoax, or something far stranger. Physical evidence remained frustratingly ambiguous. Beyond the paw prints that Price documented, there were hairs that Gief allegedly left behind. These were examined but proved inconclusive. They were consistent with various small mammals, but could not definitively identify the creature. There were scratches and marks on walls where Gief claimed to travel. There were sounds that multiple witnesses heard simultaneously, scratching and movement within the walls that seemed to follow patterns too complex for simple rodent activity. What made the investigation particularly maddening was that Gief seemed to enjoy the attention while simultaneously undermining any attempt at serious study. He would make grandiose claims about his origins and abilities, then refuse to demonstrate them when challenged. He spoke of being an earthbound spirit, of having lived for decades, of possessing knowledge beyond mortal understanding. Yet he also engaged in petty mischief, hiding objects and making rude comments like a naughty child. The journalists who came to Cashen's Gap fell into predictable camps. Some arrived as skeptics and left convinced that something genuine was occurring, even if they could not explain what. Others came prepared to expose a hoax and found themselves frustrated by the lack of clear evidence in either direction. Still others simply enjoyed the story for its entertainment value, writing sensational accounts that played loose with facts in favor of dramatic narrative. The impact on the Irving family was devastating. What privacy they had once enjoyed was completely destroyed. Strangers appeared at their door at all hours. They were mocked in the press. Voirrey, the daughter, faced particular scrutiny, with some investigators convinced she was somehow perpetrating the entire affair. The suggestion was that she was a ventriloquist, or that she was releasing a trained animal, or that she was engaged in an elaborate psychological manipulation of her parents. Yet those who spent significant time with Voirrey found these explanations unsatisfying. She was observed carefully during Gief's manifestations. Her lips did not move when the voice spoke. The voice came from locations where she was not present. The timing and complexity of the phenomena seemed beyond what a teenage girl could orchestrate, particularly given the family's isolation and limited resources. The division between believers and skeptics became increasingly bitter as the months wore on. Each side accused the other of willful blindness. The skeptics saw credulous fools being duped by a simple trick. The believers saw closed-minded materialists refusing to accept evidence that challenged their worldview. The truth, as is often the case, likely resided somewhere in the uncomfortable space between these extremes. What remained indisputable was the testimony of those 6 core witnesses. Harry Price, despite his career built on exposing frauds, never definitively declared Cashen's Gap a hoax. Lambert wrote carefully but clearly about what he had experienced. Captain MacDonald maintained his account until his death. James and Margaret Irving endured years of mockery, but never recanted their story. And Voirrey, even in her old age, decades after the events, would speak of Gief as a real presence in her childhood, however inexplicable he might have been. The investigation of Cashen's Gap ultimately proved inconclusive, but perhaps that very inconclusiveness tells us something important. Here are credible professionals, trained observers, people with reputations to protect, all reporting experiences that should not have been possible. They documented evidence that was suggestive, but not definitive. They encountered a phenomenon that seemed intelligently designed to resist conclusive proof. And through it all, Gief remained in control, speaking when he wished, appearing when he chose, forever keeping the truth just beyond reach. In the cold spring of 1931, Voirrey Irving was 13 years old and utterly alone. Not alone in the way that most adolescents feel misunderstood or isolated, but truly, profoundly alone in a manner that few people ever experience. At Cashen's Gap, the small stone farmhouse perched on the desolate moorlands of the Isle of Man, there were no neighbors within shouting distance, no school to attend, no friends to visit, No escape from the endless wind that howled across the barren landscape. There was only her father, James, a man consumed by his endless battles with vermin and his growing obsession with a strange voice that had begun speaking from the walls. There was only her mother, Margaret, worn thin by the harsh life and the creeping strangeness that had invaded their home. And there was Voirrey herself, a bright, intelligent girl trapped in what must have felt like a prison of stone and heather, with nothing but her own mind for company. The theory that haunts the GF case to this day, the darkest explanation that investigators whispered to each other and that journalists implied in carefully worded articles, is this: that there was no Mongoose at all. That every word, every laugh, every song, every threat and promise attributed to Geff the talking mongoose came from the throat of a desperate, isolated 13-year-old girl. That Voirrey Irving, whether through conscious ventriloquism or through some kind of psychological dissociation born of unbearable loneliness, created Geff herself. The evidence supporting this theory is both compelling and heartbreaking. R.S. Lambert and Harry Price, the investigators who spent the most time at Cashen's Gap, noted a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Whenever Voirrey was away from the farmhouse, Geff almost never spoke. When she was present, particularly when she was in close proximity but not directly visible, Geff became remarkably talkative. The voice seemed to follow her movements through the house. It originated from wherever Voirrey happened to be, speaking from behind walls she stood near, from beneath floorboards where she walked, from the dark spaces adjacent to her presence. Price conducted careful experiments, separating family members, positioning himself at different points in the house, trying to catch the source of the voice. He found that when Voirrey was isolated in one room and other investigators were positioned elsewhere, Geff fell silent. When she rejoined the group, the voice would return, always from some concealed location, always just out of sight. The mongoose, it seemed, required Voirrey's presence to exist. More tellingly, Price noticed that Voirrey's lips sometimes moved slightly when Geff spoke, tiny movements that she seemed unable to fully control. He observed her positioning herself strategically during Geff's performances, placing herself near walls and corners where sound could be projected and distorted. He noted that the girl seemed to know instinctively where Geff would speak next, turning her head toward the source just before the voice emerged. But it was more than just physical evidence that pointed toward Voirrey. It was the psychological profile that emerged when one looked carefully at her situation. Here was a girl who should have been in school, learning alongside peers, forming friendships, discovering herself in the social crucible of adolescence. Instead, she was trapped in isolation so complete that it bordered on psychological torture. The Isle of Man in the early 1930s was not populous to begin with, but Cashen's Gap stood apart, even from the sparse communities that dotted the island. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that visiting required deliberate effort and planning. James Irving had removed his daughter from formal schooling, whether due to distance, expense, or his own paranoid tendencies. Voirrey's education happened at home, such as it was, with parents who were themselves limited in their own learning. For a bright child, and all accounts suggest Voirrey was exceptionally intelligent, this isolation must have been suffocating. She had books, but no one to discuss them with. She had thoughts and ideas and questions, but no peers to share them with. She had the capacity for imagination and creativity, but no outlet for expression that wouldn't be dismissed or ignored in the harsh practicality of farm life. Child psychologists who have examined the case in retrospect note that these are precisely the conditions that can create dissociative states or elaborate fantasy lives. A mind that is understimulated and isolated will create its own stimulation. A child who has no power or agency in her own life might create an alter ego that possesses both. Geff the talking mongoose was powerful where Voirrey was powerless. He was free to roam the moorlands while she was confined to the farmhouse. He could be rude and demanding while she had to be obedient and polite. He drew attention and fascination while she was expected to remain invisible. The content of Geff's conversations supports this psychological reading. The mongoose spoke often about things a 13-year-old girl might find interesting: gossip about neighbors, observations about visitors, complaints about food and comfort, demands for attention and treats. He sang popular songs of the era, songs that a young girl might have heard on the radio and memorized. He claimed to travel to distant places and report back on what he saw there. the perfect fantasy for someone who never went anywhere herself. He became, in essence, everything Voirrey might have wished to be, but could not. There is also the matter of motive. If one assumes that Voirrey created Geff consciously, through deliberate ventriloquism, what would drive a 13-year-old to maintain such an elaborate deception? The answer becomes clear when one considers what Geff brought to the Irving household. He brought attention, excitement, interest from the outside world. Suddenly investigators were visiting, journalists were writing articles, letters were arriving from across Britain and beyond. The crushing isolation was broken. People came to Cashen's Gap, and they listened. They paid attention. They took the Irvings seriously in a way that poor moorland farmers were rarely taken seriously. For Voirrey specifically, Geff brought something even more valuable. He brought her father's attention and approval. James Irving became obsessed with Geff, spending hours trying to communicate with the Mongoose, defending his existence to skeptics, documenting every word and event. For a man who had previously been consumed by the grim necessities of survival farming and the endless battle against rabbits and rats, Geff became the center of his world. And if Voirrey was the source of Geff, then she had found a way, perhaps the only way available to her, to become important to her father. But here is where the theory becomes truly tragic. If Voirrey did create Geff, whether consciously or through some dissociative process, she could never admit it. To admit it would be to destroy the only meaningful thing in her life, to return to the crushing isolation, to lose the attention and importance that Geff had brought her. She would have been trapped in her own creation, forced to maintain the performance or face consequences she couldn't bear to contemplate. The evidence against the ventriloquism theory is equally significant, and it centers on Voirrey herself. When confronted with the accusation that she was creating Geff's voice, the girl's reaction was not the defensiveness of someone caught in a lie. It was raw, genuine distress and anger. She wept. She protested. She refused to speak to investigators who suggested she was responsible. Her emotional responses seemed too authentic, too deeply felt, to be mere performance. Multiple witnesses, including skeptical investigators, reported hearing Geff's voice when they could see Voirrey clearly and observed that her lips were not moving. Harry Price himself admitted that on several occasions he heard the voice while watching Voirrey carefully, and he could not detect any movement or technique that would explain it. Other visitors reported similar experiences, hearing Geff speak from locations where Voirrey could not possibly project her voice without obvious effort. There were also instances when Geff appeared to know things that Voirrey could not have known, reporting on events happening outside the house, or revealing information about visitors that the girl had no apparent way of learning. These incidents were fewer and less well documented than believers claimed, but they existed in the record and resisted easy explanation. The most compelling argument against Voirrey's guilt, however, is the sheer duration and consistency of the phenomenon. Geff's voice was heard over a period of several years, maintaining the same character, the same speech patterns, the same personality throughout. For a 13-year-old girl to maintain such a performance for so long, through countless interviews and investigations and surprise visits, without ever breaking character or making a revealing mistake, seems to stretch credibility past the breaking point. And yet, the correlation remained undeniable. Geff spoke when Voirrey was present and fell silent when she was not. The voice required her proximity to exist. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between deliberate hoax and genuine supernatural phenomenon. Perhaps Voirrey did not consciously create Geff through ventriloquism, but rather channeled him through some psychological mechanism she did not understand or control. Dissociative identity disorder, though it would not be formally recognized and named for decades, could explain how a traumatized, isolated child might fragment her consciousness and create an alternative identity that could express things she could not. In this reading, Voirrey would have been both innocent and guilty, both victim and perpetrator. She would not have been lying when she denied creating Geff because, in her subjective experience, she did not create him. He was real to her, as real as her own thoughts, perhaps more real, because he existed outside her conscious control. The distress she showed at the accusations was genuine because she genuinely believed she was not responsible. But whether Geff was a mongoose, a spirit, a dissociative state, or a conscious hoax, One fact remains absolutely clear and utterly heartbreaking. The phenomenon destroyed Voirrey Irving's life. When the investigators finally left and the journalists stopped writing their articles, when the excitement faded and the attention moved on to other mysteries, Voirrey was still there. Still at Cashen's Gap, still isolated, but now with an additional burden. She was not just the lonely farm girl anymore. She was the girl from the Mongoose story, the possible hoaxer, the object of suspicion and ridicule. She never married. She never left the Isle of Man for long. She never escaped the shadow of Geth. As she grew older and her parents died, she remained at Cashen's Gap for as long as she could, living in the house where the voice had once spoken from the walls. When she finally had to leave, when the farm was sold and demolished, she moved into quiet obscurity in a nearby town. But the story followed her. For decades, she refused to speak about GFIF. When journalists tracked her down, she turned them away. When researchers approached her, she declined to be interviewed. The bright 13-year-old girl had become a reclusive old woman who wanted only to be left alone, to forget, to move past the thing that had defined and destroyed her youth. In 2005, shortly before her death at the age of 87, Voirrey Irving granted one final interview. She was asked directly whether she had created Jeff's voice. She denied it, as she always had, with what the interviewer described as quiet firmness. But then she said something that revealed the true cost of the mystery. She said that GF, real or not, had ruined her life, not complicated her life, not made her famous, ruined her life. Think about what that word means, coming from an old woman looking back across 7 decades. It means that whatever really happened in that farmhouse on the lonely moorland, whatever the truth about the voice that spoke from the walls, the ultimate victim was Voirrey Irving. Whether she created GF or encountered him, whether she lied or told the truth, whether she was hoaxer or witness, or something more complex than either category allows, she paid a price that no 13-year-old child should ever have to pay. She paid with her entire existence, with every year that followed those strange months in 1931. She paid with her privacy, her reputation, her chances at a normal life, her opportunities for love and family and escape. She paid with her peace of mind, living always under the shadow of suspicion, never fully believed and never fully exonerated. This is the real horror at the heart of the Jeff case. Not the impossible talking mongoose, not the unexplained voices or the mysterious paw prints or the alleged sighting. The real horror is what isolation and attention and mystery can do to a young girl's life. The real tragedy is that in our fascination with the puzzle, we often forget there was a human being at the center of it, a child who deserved better than to spend her entire life as the subject of speculation and doubt. Voirrey Irving died alone, having lived alone, haunted to her final day by something that happened when she was 13 years old. Whether that something was a supernatural encounter, or a psychological crisis, or a desperate bid for attention in unbearable isolation, it consumed her. Gef the talking mongoose, real or imagined, destroyed the girl who was his primary witness, leaving her trapped forever in a story she could neither escape nor explain, believed by some and suspected by others, but understood by no one at all. The evidence sits in archives now, cataloged and photographed, each piece carefully preserved yet stubbornly refusing to provide the answers that researchers have sought for nearly a century. Physical remnants of the GF case exist in scattered collections across Britain, tangible reminders of something that may or may not have haunted a remote farmhouse on the Isle of Man. Each artifact tells a partial story, offers a fragment of possibility, but never quite crosses the threshold from suggestive to conclusive. The mystery of the Dalby spook endures precisely because of what these items fail to prove, hanging forever in that maddening space between explanation and impossibility. The photographs taken at Dorlish Cashen present the first category of evidence, images that document alleged physical traces left by the creature. On the wooden paneling of the farmhouse walls, particularly in the upper reaches near the ceiling and along the stairway, scratches appeared that the Irving family attributed to Gia. Investigators photographed these marks in meticulous detail, capturing the way they scored the surface in clusters and patterns. The scratches varied in depth and length, some shallow and tentative, others deeper, as though whatever created them had pressed with considerable force. They appeared most frequently in areas where the family claimed Geoff traveled, following the routes they said he took through the house's hidden spaces. Harry Price examined these photographs with intense scrutiny during his investigation, comparing the marks to scratches made by known animals. The patterns proved difficult to categorize definitively. They resembled claw marks in some respects, but the spacing seemed unusual for common domestic animals. Some scratches appeared in locations that would have required an animal to reach awkward angles or maintain precarious positions. Price noted in his reports that while the marks were certainly real, their origin remained stubbornly unclear. A cat might have made some of them, perhaps, or a rat accessing the wall cavities, but others defied easy explanation. The photographs exist still, grainy black and white images showing scored wood, but they raise more questions than they answer. Then there were the paw prints, perhaps the most intriguing physical traces that investigators document. In dust accumulated on surfaces throughout the farmhouse, small impressions appeared that the Irvings insisted belonged to Geoff. Harry Price, ever the methodical researcher, brought materials to create plaster casts of these prints, preserving them for analysis. The resulting casts showed minute detail, tiny toe pads, and the suggestion of claws, prints that measured just over an inch in length. Price transported these casts back to London, where he consulted with zoologists and veterinary experts, seeking identification. The results disappointed everyone hoping for clarity. The prints matched no known local animal perfectly. They bore resemblance to both dog and cat paw prints, but corresponded precisely to neither. The size suggested something small, perhaps a young ferret or a pine marten, though pine martens had been extinct on the Isle of Man for generations. One expert proposed that the prints might belong to a small dog breed, possibly a terrier puppy, but the Irving family owned no such animal during the period when the prints appeared. Another suggested a cat, though again the dimensions proved slightly wrong. The plaster casts survive in the Harry Price collection, small white reproductions of something that once pressed into farmhouse dust. Their origin still categorized as inconclusive nearly 90 years later. Hair samples added another layer to the physical evidence, tufts collected from various locations around Dorlish Cashen where the family claimed Geoff had been active. These samples, some found caught on rough wood, others discovered in areas where the creature allegedly rested, were preserved and sent for analysis. The microscopic examination revealed hair consistent with domestic animals, most likely dog or cat, but with certain unusual characteristics that prevented definite identification. The color was described as yellowish-brown, matching the descriptions the Irvings gave of Geoff's fur. The texture showed qualities of both guard hairs and undercoat, the diameter falling within ranges seen in multiple species. What made the hair samples particularly frustrating was their very mundanity. They were clearly from a mammal, clearly from something that might reasonably exist on a farm, yet they refused to align perfectly with any single species. Laboratory technicians noted subtle anomalies in the hair structure, minor variations that might indicate mixed breeding in a domestic animal, or might suggest something less easily categorized. The reports stamped the samples as inconclusive, a word that would become synonymous with the entire Geoff investigation. The hair could have come from a stray dog that had somehow entered the farmhouse. It might have belonged to a feral cat. It could potentially have been from the creature the Irvings called Geoff. The evidence permitted all these possibilities while confirming none. The single photograph allegedly showing Geoff himself stands as perhaps the most tantalizing and simultaneously disappointing piece of evidence. Taken by one of the investigators during the 1930s, this blurry image purports to show the creature positioned on a rocky outcrop near the farmhouse. The photograph is maddeningly indistinct, a blur of light and shadow that might show a small animal, or might show nothing more than a trick of exposure and development. Enhanced analysis in later years has failed to clarify the image significantly. What appears to be a pointed snout could equally be a rock formation. What might be a tail could be a plant stem or a camera artifact. The eyes that some observers claim to see in the photograph vanish entirely when other people examine the same image. This photograph represents the best visual evidence ever obtained of the Dalby spook, and it reveals almost nothing. Its very existence frustrates researchers because it suggests that at some moment, someone nearly captured proof, nearly pinned down the mystery, but fell just short. The image has been reproduced in countless books and articles about the case, always with appropriate caveats about its ambiguity, always with the acknowledgement that viewers will see different things according to their preconception. Believers perceive the outline of an animal unknown to science. Skeptics see photographic blur and wishful thinking. The truth remains locked in gelatin and silver halide, refusing to emerge with clarity. Harry Price's frustration grew with each inconclusive finding. A man who had built his reputation on investigating paranormal claims and exposing frauds when he found them, Price approached the GF case with sophisticated equipment and systematic methodology. He installed special cameras designed to trigger automatically. He laid flour on surfaces to capture footprints more clearly. He attempted to record Gef's voice using the best audio equipment available in the 1930s. Despite all these efforts, definitive proof eluded him. Every experiment produced results that were suggestive, interesting, worthy of note, but never conclusive. In his final reports on the case, Price admitted this fundamental limitation. He wrote that the evidence pointed towards something genuinely unusual occurring at Dorlish Cashen, something that could not be easily dismissed as simple fraud or misidentification. Yet, he could not state with certainty what that something was. The photographs showed marks that might have been made by an unknown animal. The paw prints resembled, but did not match known species. The hair samples defied precise categorization. The voice recordings captured sounds that seemed to demonstrate intelligence, but could potentially be explained by human mimicry. Price concluded that the case remained unproven, suspended in ambiguity, neither confirmed nor debunked. The 1947 postscript added a final strange chapter to the physical evidence. After the Irving family left Dorlish Cashen in 1945, new owners moved into the isolated farmhouse. In 1947, these new residents reportedly shot a creature they claimed was the Dalby spook, ending the mystery that had haunted the property for nearly 2 decades. News of this shooting reached the Irvings, who by then had relocated elsewhere on the Isle of Man. James Irving traveled to examine the body of the shot animal. His conclusion was unequivocal. This was not GF. Whatever creature the new owners had killed, James Irving insisted it bore no resemblance to the being that had spoken to his family, that had shared their lives for so many years. The body was reportedly that of a small, nondescript animal, possibly a feral cat or a young fox. Nothing that could account for the intelligence and personality the Irvings attributed to Gia. The new owners maintained that they had killed the creature responsible for strange noises and disturbances in the farmhouse. The Irvings maintained with equal certainty that Geff remained alive somewhere, perhaps having chosen to leave when his family departed, perhaps still haunting the hills and valleys of the Isle of Man. This disagreement over the shot creature's identity perfectly encapsulates the entire Geff case. Even when physical evidence appeared, even when a body could be examined, consensus proved impossible. The truth splintered into competing narratives, each side certain of their interpretation, neither able to provide proof that would satisfy the other. The body itself disappeared from the historical record, never preserved, never scientifically examined. Another piece of potential evidence that slipped away before it could be properly analyzed. Every artifact from the GF case follows this pattern, falling just short of the proof that would resolve the mystery definitively. The scratches on the walls are real but could have multiple explanations. The paw prints exist in plaster casts but match no known animal exactly. The hair samples survive but yield inconclusive results when analyzed. The photograph shows something but nothing clearly identifiable. Even the supposed body of Geff became a subject of dispute rather than final confirmation. The evidence forms a trail of near misses, each piece tantalizing, non-sufficient. This ambiguity has allowed the mystery to endure far longer than clearer-cut cases. Without definitive proof either confirming or debunking the existence of the talking mongoose, the story remains open, inviting each new generation to examine the evidence and draw their own conclusions. The physical remnants sit in archives and private collections, available for study but eternally non-committal about what they truly represent. They maintain the mystery's delicate balance, providing just enough substance to prevent dismissal as pure fantasy, while offering just too little certainty to confirm the impossible. In this eternal ambiguity lies the enduring power of the Dalby spook, a case where the evidence itself seems designed to preserve rather than solve the riddle at its heart. The rain falls on the cottage roof the same way it did 90 years ago. That gentle, persistent drumming against slate and stone. The sound that masked so many scratching footsteps, so many whispered conversations in the darkness. The cottage still stands there on the Isle of Man, a weathered sentinel on the slopes of Dalby Mountain, and if you were to walk through its rooms today, you would find those same narrow spaces between the walls, those same hidden gaps and crawlways where something small and clever could hide, watching, leading, waiting. And after 90 years, after thousands of pages of testimony and investigation, after all the theories and explanations and dismissals, we are left with the same question that troubled Harry Price when he left that house in the summer of 1935. What was Giev? The skeptical explanation seems obvious at first. Voirrey Irving, a lonely child on an isolated farm, invented an imaginary friend and sustained the deception for years. Her parents, desperate for attention or caught in their daughter's fantasy, became willing accomplices in the fraud. It's a tidy solution, one that allows us to file the case away and move on. But this explanation requires us to ignore mountains of evidence that don't quite fit. How did Voirrey, when she was demonstrably in one room with witnesses watching her every move, produce Gieff's voice from another part of the house entirely? Captain MacDonald, a man trained in observation and deception, specifically arranged tests where he could see Voirrey while hearing Gieff speak from locations she could not possibly reach. He stationed himself where he could watch her throat, her breathing, her posture, looking for any sign of ventriloquism, and found none. The voice came from the walls, from the attic spaces, from outside the windows, while the girl sat perfectly still, her lips barely moving. And what of the times when Gieff spoke while Voirrey was away from the cottage entirely? Multiple witnesses, including skeptical investigators, reported hearing the voice when the girl was at school or visiting neighbors. James Irving himself, no fool despite his eccentricities, conducted his own tests. He would send Voirrey on errands to distant farms while he remained home alone, and Gieff would still speak to him, still move objects, still scratch inside the walls with that distinctive sound that had become so terribly familiar. Then, there is the matter of information. Gieff described events happening miles away with uncanny accuracy. He reported the details of conversations between people he should never have encountered, knew the contents of letters before they were opened, described the color and make of cars driving on roads beyond any possible line of sight from the cottage. Skeptics suggest that Voirrey gleaned this information from gossip and lucky guesses, but the precision was often too exact, too immediate, too specific to attribute to rumor or coincidence. Captain MacDonald documented one particularly troubling incident. Gieff described, in real time, a funeral procession taking place in a village over 3 miles away. He named the deceased, described the mourners, mentioned a woman wearing an unusual green coat. MacDonald later verified every detail. How did a 13-year-old girl, isolated on a mountain farm, acquire such specific information about an event happening at that exact moment? The physical evidence presents its own contradictions. The hair samples that Gieff provided, and that were analyzed by multiple experts. Some were identified as dog hair, but others remained genuinely puzzling. The paw prints in plasticine showed anatomy that didn't quite match any known British mammal. The photographs were admittedly inconclusive, but they were also never proven to be fraudulent. And there were the scratches, the bite marks on pencils, the small items moved and hidden in places requiring both intelligence and a body much smaller than a human child. Perhaps most troubling are the investigators themselves. Harry Price had built his reputation on exposing frauds. He debunked spirit mediums, revealed fake ectoplasm, caught countless charlatans in their deceptions. He arrived at the Irving cottage fully expecting to solve the case in an afternoon, to catch the ventriloquist trick or spot the hidden speaker. Instead, he left unsettled, unwilling to declare the case either genuine or fraudulent, his confidence shaken by experiences he couldn't easily explain. Captain MacDonald was even more hardened in his skepticism. A military man, an engineer, someone trained to observe and analyze. He'd investigated numerous paranormal claims and found them all wanting. Yet he spent weeks at the cottage, conducting careful experiments, and emerged convinced that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. He witnessed Gieff's intelligence, heard the voice's emotional range, observed phenomena that defied his attempts at rational explanation. He never claimed Gieff was a real mongoose. but he also never claimed it was a simple fraud. The mass hysteria theory asks us to believe that multiple witnesses, including trained investigators, all succumb to the same delusion. But mass hysteria typically requires suggestible people in high-stress situations, feeding off each other's fears. The witnesses at Cashen included journalists, scientists, skeptics who arrived specifically to debunk the case. They weren't religious zealots or spiritualists desperate to believe. They were professionals who expected to find fraud and instead found something they couldn't classify. And fraud itself presents enormous practical difficulties. For Voirrey to sustain such a deception would require not just ventriloquism skills, far beyond professional performers, but the ability to throw her voice into sealed spaces, to produce sound while under direct observation, to maintain perfect consistency across thousands of conversations over 6 years. It would require her parents to be complicit in elaborate hoax that brought them nothing but ridicule and unwanted attention. It would require fooling investigators who were actively trying to expose them. Consider the physical demands. To create the scratching sounds in the walls, someone would need to navigate the narrow spaces between the cottage's stone walls. Spaces barely wide enough for a child's arm, much less a full human body. The cottage was searched repeatedly. Investigators examined every crawl space, every gap, every possible hiding spot. They found evidence that something had been moving through those spaces, disturbing the dust, leaving traces of passage, but never found any way a human could navigate that maze of stone and timber. The poltergeist theory offers a different explanation, one rooted in psychic phenomena rather than fraud. Perhaps Voirrey was an unconscious focus for telekinetic activity, her adolescent energy manifesting as the GF personality. This explains why the activity seemed centered on her, why it began around her 13th birthday, why it eventually faded as she grew older. But this explanation still requires us to believe in abilities that science cannot verify or measure. It trades one impossibility for another. The genuine cryptid hypothesis that GF was exactly what he claimed to be, a mongoose with human intelligence and speech, seems absurd on its face. Yet it accounts for the evidence more completely than any other theory. A small, intelligent animal living in the cottage walls would explain the sounds, the size of the spaces used, the physical evidence of droppings in hair. But it cannot explain the speech, the knowledge, the personality, unless we accept that evolution, or some stranger force, created something utterly unique on that isolated farm. What we're left with is an impossible choice. Every explanation requires us to believe something extraordinary. Either a child was a genius fraud who never slipped up in 6 years of constant scrutiny, or multiple trained investigators were all incompetent or deluded, or the laws of physics and biology were temporarily suspended in one cottage on the Isle of Man. 6 witnesses, some of them skeptical professionals specifically trying to expose a hoax, all confirmed the same impossible experience. They heard the voice. They witnessed the intelligence behind it. They observed phenomena they couldn't explain. Their testimonies remain, documented in letters and reports and articles, a historical record of something that shouldn't have been possible. The cottage endures, weathered but standing, its walls still honeycombed with those narrow spaces, those dark passages where something small could hide. Visitors still come, drawn by the story, hoping perhaps to hear a whisper from the walls, a scratch in the darkness. The Isle of Man Tourism Board has largely forgotten Gief, embarrassed perhaps by the strangeness of the tale, but the cottage remembers. Gief himself, whatever he was, remains the most well-documented and thoroughly investigated talking animal case in paranormal history. No other case has such extensive testimony, such determined investigation by credible witnesses, such a wealth of physical evidence, however ambiguous. The files that Harry Price assembled, now held in archives, represent hundreds of hours of interviews, tests, observations, and analysis. And none of it brings us closer to a definitive answer. Perhaps that is Gief's final trick, his lasting legacy. Not proof of the impossible, but the persistence of mystery in an age that believes it has explained everything. He reminds us that there are still questions without answers, experiences that resist classification, moments when the world reveals itself as stranger and more complex than our theories allow. And so the mystery endures as permanent and solid as the cottage walls. Gef's voice has been silent for nearly 90 years now, but his words remain, recorded in testimony and transcripts, a challenge and a promise. I am a ghost in the form of a mongoose, and I shall haunt you with weird noises and clanking chains. Perhaps he still does. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.